The concept of controlled societies is usually associated with Deleuze's famous text, the Postscript. That text has become one of the most influential diagnoses of contemporary forms of power. My aim today is not to challenge that diagnosis, but to revisit it from a different angle. More specifically, I want to explore what happens when we approach controlled societies through Felix Guattari rather than primarily through Deleuze. My hypothesis is that Guattari allows us to shift the discussion from diagnosis toward cartography, whereas Deleuze emphasizes the forms and mechanisms of control. Guattari is more concerned with processes, assemblages, and modes of subjectivation. This shift does not negate control, but it changes how we think about its operation and its possibilities. The result is a perspective that opens ethical, aesthetical, and political pathways within the very processes that constitute contemporary control. In the Postscript, Deleuze argues that disciplinary societies are being replaced by a new social configuration. The central issue is no longer enclosure within institutions, but continuous modulation across open systems. Power no longer operates primarily through confinement, but through permanent variation, adjustment, and circulation. Deleuze's text captures a historical mutation in the way power organizes conduct. It is for this reason that the notion of controlled societies became so important for understanding contemporary capitalism, digital technologies, and informational networks. One of Deleuze's most famous formulations is the distinction between molds and modulations. Disciplinary institutions function through relatively stable molds that shape individuals within enclosed spaces. Controlled societies operate differently. Modulation is flexible, continuous, and adaptive. Rather than producing fixed identities, it continuously adjusts behavior according to changing conditions. Power becomes less visible as a structure and more widespread as a process. Control does not stop at institutional boundaries because those boundaries themselves become increasingly permeable. What emerges is a social field organized by circulation, communication, and continuous variation. This transformation also affects the form of subjectivity. The individual of disciplinary societies gives way to what Deleuze calls the individual. The individual is not primarily defined by personal identity, but by fragments of information, codes, and data. Subjects become increasingly integrated into informational processes that classify, evaluate, and circulate them. The language of signatures and numbers is replaced by the language of codes and databases. What matters is less who one is than how one is tracked, processed, and connected. Subjectivity becomes inseparable from informational infrastructures. This is why the concept of the individual has become so influential in discussions of digital capitalism and algorithmic governance. The logic of modulation implies that control becomes continuous. One is no longer simply inside or outside institutions. Instead, one moves through an uninterrupted series of evaluations, permissions, and adjustments. Deleuze describes this transformation through the figure of depth. Depth becomes a general condition of permanent accountability and continuous assessment. Control no longer appears as a discrete intervention, but as an ongoing environment. This diagnosis captures a world in which monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation become increasingly normalized. The result is a social field in which modulation appears to extend indefinitely across everyday life. The strength of Deleuze's text is also the source of one of its limitations. It often appears to privilege the form of control over the processes that operate within it. The result is a picture in which modulation tends to appear as a closed horizon. What becomes difficult to think is not control itself, but the possibilities that remain within its operation. The question is therefore not whether control exists, but how subjectivities continue to emerge inside its networks. Put differently, the issue is no longer identifying mechanism of domination, but understanding how processes of subjectivation unfold within those very mechanisms. This is precisely the point at which Guattari becomes particularly relevant. Rather than asking what control is, he encourages us to ask how it functions and what it procedures. Guattari approaches many of the same transformations described by Deleuze, yet his perspective is significantly different. His attention is directed less toward the structures of domination and more toward processes of production. Rather than beginning with forms of power, he begins with modes of subjectivation. This produces a methodological displacement. Diagnosis gives way to cartography. Representation gives way to experimentation. The question is no longer how to describe a system from the outside, but how to map processes from within their own movement. This displacement is grounded in what we might call Guattari's machinic ontology. For Guattari, machines are not simply technical instruments, nor are they merely technological devices. The concept of machine refers to assemblages that connect heterogeneous components and generate effects of subjectivation. Machines operate at the intersection of technical, social, semiotic, affective, and existential dimensions. They are not external to human life. They participate directly in the production of sensibility, perception, desire, and thought. This is why Guattari can speak of machines operating at the very heart of subjectivity. Once machines are understood in this sense, technology can no longer be reduced to a mechanism of domination. It becomes a constitutive dimension of existence itself. One of the consequences of this perspective is that machines always exceed the technical domain. A mechanic assemblage is never purely technological. It involves bodies, affects, signs, intuitions, desires, environments, and technical components. What matters is not the individual element, but the relations established among heterogeneous elements. Guattari therefore proposes a radically transversal conception of reality. The social, the biological, the semiotic, and the technical are constantly interwoven. Subjectivity emerges from these connections rather than preceding them. This is why mechanic assemblages must be understood ecologically. They constitute environments of existence rather than isolated objects. Control itself can therefore be approached as a complex ecology of relations rather than as a single structure of domination. From this perspective, subjectivity is a process that is continuously produced and transformed. Subjectivation occurs through the encounters between affects, science, technologies, institutions, and collective arrangements. The subject is not the origin of these processes, is one of their effects. This is one of the reasons why Guattari places so much emphasis on the production of subjectivity. Contemporary technologies are not external influences acting upon an already constituted self. They participate directly in the formation of sensibilities, desires, and modes of existence. The question, therefore, becomes how these processes can generate singularization rather than uniformity. One of Guattari's most remarkable intuitions concerns what he called the post-media era. Unlike many critical theories of communication, Guattari did not understand media simply as apparatuses of ideological manipulation. His question was how new technological environments could transform the very conditions of subjectivation. For this reason, he has less interest in media as channels of transmission than in media as existential environments. The well-known example of young people wandering with a Walkman illustrates this point. What is important is not the device itself, but the production of new affective territories through technological mediation. These subjects are inhabited by ritornellos, rhythms, sounds, signs, and effects that circulate through mechanic networks. Subjectivity is increasingly composed through mobile, mediated, and translocal assemblages. The post-media condition, therefore, names a transformation in the ecology of existence itself. Guattari repeatedly suggests that contemporary technologies modify our relation to images, information, and communication. The image ceases to function primarily as representation. It increasingly becomes a flexible interface. This transformation affects not only the perception but also the subjectivation. Informational flows are not external to experience, they participate in its production. Databases, communication networks, and technological interfaces become components of existential territories. This is why Guattari refuses to oppose technology and life. Technological systems are already integrated into the production of sensibility and desire. What emerges is a world in which informational processes become constitutive elements of subjectivity. The question then becomes how these processes might generate singularization rather than standardization. At this point, we can understand why cartography becomes such a central concept for Guattari. Cartography is an intervention within ongoing processes. It follows assemblages in motion. It maps the relations through which subjectivities, affects, institutions, technologies, and environments are produced while being produced. In this sense, cartography is inseparable from experimentation. It seeks to identify potentials, bifurcations, and lines of transformation. In the context of controlled societies, this means tracing processes across multiple planes simultaneously. In my reading, 3 of these planes become especially relevant: urban, informational, and affective. The task is not to escape these processes, but to understand how they compose contemporary modes of existence. This cartographic perspective leads directly to a micropolitical conception of politics. The production of subjectivity is itself a political terrain. What is at stake are modes of perception, sensibility, desire, and existence. Micropolitics, therefore, concerns the process through which subjectivities are formed and transformed. This does not replace macropolitics, but it reveals another dimension operating alongside or underneath it. Controlled societies function through everyday assemblages and affective economies. For this reason, experimentation becomes a political practice. To experiment is to intervene in processes of subjectivation. It is to create openings within configurations that otherwise appear fixed or inevitable. One of the most important consequences of this perspective is that technologies cannot be understood solely in terms of domination. Guattari repeatedly rejects both technophobia and technological determinism. Machines are never politically neutral. What matters are the uses to which they are put. The same technological infrastructure can support processes of standardization or processes of singularization. This is why Guattari places such emphasis on reappropriation. Reappropriation does not mean returning to a pre-technological condition. It means intervening within mechanic processes and redirecting their operation. The political question becomes one of experimentation with uses, connections, and compositions. What interests Guattari is not the rejection of machines, but the invention of new relations with them. One of Guattari's most provocative claims is that values are not external to machines. Modern critical thought often opposes technology and value, machinery and meaning, technical system and human purposes. Guattari proposes a very different perspective. Machines do not simply execute values established elsewhere. They participate in the production itself of values. Every mechanic assemblage involves ways of perceiving, feeling, desiring, and inhabiting the world, values. Questions of ethics, therefore, cannot be separated from questions of technicity. The issue is not whether machines threaten human values. The issue is what kind of values are produced through specific mechanic configurations. This shifts ethics away from abstract principles and toward processes of existential production. It is precisely this problem that leads Guattari toward ecosophy. Ecosophy is an attempt to think together three inseparable ecological registers: mental, social, and environmental ecology. Contemporary crises are never purely economic, technological, political, or environmental. They involve transformations in the production of subjectivity itself. For this reason, no ecological transformation is possible without the transformation in modes of existence. Ecosophy proposes an ethico-political articulation across heterogeneous domains. Its objective is not equilibrium, but the creation of new existential territories. What matters is the capacity to compose new relations between subjectivities, social formations, and environments. In this sense, ecosophy radicalizes the cartographic perspective by extending it across the entire field of existence. We can now return to the initial problem of controlled societies. From a Guattarian perspective, control cannot be reduced to a closed system of domination, nor can it be understood simply as an expansion of technological power. Controlled societies are also environments within which processes of subjectivation continue to unfold. The same mechanic networks that facilitate control may also generate new possibilities for singularization. This does not mean that domination disappears. It means that domination and creation coexist within the same field of processes. The task is therefore not merely to denounce control, is to identify and cultivate the potentials that emerge within its operation. Cartography becomes inseparable from creation because every cartography of processes is simultaneously an intervention on them.